Aging Bayri Mentorgi. Happy Mother's Day. One word that I understand very well as an American, but I find very confusing in Mongolian, I was just telling Tim this morning, is the word mama. We all have a conception of what mama is, right? In Mongolian, the word mama means a tiny baby. So people all the time would be mama this and mama that, and I would have, took me a long time, a couple of years, to be able to think baby when I heard the word mama, because I always thought the mother. The formal word for baby or infant is nielchuhed. So you can see why they chose mama. What is a missionary? I thought maybe Pastor Ed would have his cell phone. Just a wild guess that he would. And that he could look up a definition of missionary for us, just to refresh us. When I took time to look it up, I found a really interesting quote on the OMF website that I will just read. The Greek word implies that there is an authority beyond the sent one, a sender. The messenger himself is not the authority. The messenger simply represents an authority. By simplest definition then, a missionary is a sent one. A missionary is a messenger or an envoy who is sent out on a special mission with the authority of the Father.
Right, that's the first definition here too. The second definition is a person strongly in favor of a program, set of principles, etc., who attempts to persuade or convert others.
Okay, very good. So I think for our purposes, for my thinking, just as we think together here, if we consider ourselves, those of us sitting here, which is probably most, if not all of us, who call ourselves Christians, would be that we are missionaries, but under the definition that we are sent ones, under the authority of God. So I think if we keep that in mind, it will help with the understanding that a missionary isn't simply a term that causes a lot of Christians to stumble who've heard the song, "Please Don't Send Me to Africa," or other such songs like that. It's not just about going overseas and dealing with whatever trials come from being an overseas missionary. So if we're sent ones, then where have we been sent? Glenn, where have you been sent?
I've been sent here.
Bopo, where have you been sent? Where did God send you? Here. From where? She's come a long ways, folks. What is our job as missionaries then, if we're sent ones under the authority of God? Anyone?
Spread the word of God.
Okay, spread the word of God. And then, obviously, we've covered this, but sent under the authority of God himself. Okay, we can relax and take a deep breath now. Because we understand we're not the one in control here. We're sent on a mission. God is our supreme commander. He's the one who sent us. And we have to what then? Look at him and do what he says. Okay? It seems really easy when you think of it just in those simple terms. Obviously, we all know it's not quite that easy. I gave someone Matthew 28:18-20, if they could read that for us.
Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I will be with you always, to the very end of the age."
Thank you. So is everyone who's a Christian somebody sent by God to convey the message of the gospel? Every one of us? Yes? Okay. I know I'm being a little redundant. It's just for the purposes of thinking together, because it takes a while for me to have things sink in a little bit. So some people have asked me, why did I become an overseas missionary? Why did I go overseas? And the simple answer is, God told me to. Now, what you may not know is that I'm just a really simple farm girl. I took Spanish in high school, and the only reason I passed my Spanish class is because I had red hair, and so did my teacher, and no one else did in our school. And so she liked me and passed me. I didn't really learn Spanish. I didn't pass a single test in my Spanish class. And for those of you who know anything about languages, you know that for an American, Spanish is fairly easy to learn compared to other ones, compared to Mongolian especially. But I was working and living at his mansion ministries, and I had been there close to 9 years when, and I was happy to stay there. I loved what I was doing there. And it was God very directly told me to go. I needed to leave there. So I told my boss, I need to go. Probably in 9 months was the best time frame I could give him, because that God didn't tell me when and he didn't tell me where. He just said go. So from there on, I just commenced every day for a half an hour. I would walk and pray about what God wanted me to do. And it was about 9 months later when he said, it was about 6 months later when he said, Mongolia. I'm like, well, that's clear. It was unequivocally clear. And that's exactly how he said it, just that word. And so I knew. So from that point, I set my focus on going to Mongolia, whatever it took to get there. And I didn't really know, because like I said, I'm a simple farm girl. How does one go overseas as a missionary? Tim and I have been reading through the Bible together, and recently we read what I found was an interesting passage, Ezekiel 3, 5, and 6. Someone has that?
You are not being sent to a people of obscure speech and difficult language, but to the house of Israel, not to many people of obscure speech and difficult language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely, if I had sent you to them, they would have listened to you.
Thank you. So God actually gives a call to people to go to their own people. And I, of course, probably read it before, but it just jumped out to me this time in reading it. He can call specifically overseas, and some of us he calls specifically here. So it seems obvious, and now in my notes it seems especially redundant since we're going over this, that God has chosen each of us who live here on Cape Cod or Buzzards Bay or wherever we live, with some of our visitors, that he has sent us to that place. Now, it may seem like, okay, I chose to marry Tim Byrne, this is where he lives, so this is where I ended up. Well, but I think God is greater than that. I think he uses all these circumstances to place us where he wants us, and this is where he wants me right now, where he has each of us where he has us right now for his purposes. When I went over to Mongolia, I encountered two really different types of thinking regarding missionaries, and it's kind of like two schools of thought that different missionaries have. One of them is that you learn the culture, learn the language, adapt to it as much as, I would say, biblical constraints would allow you to become a part of that language so that the people will listen to you. And what I discovered is the more language that I learned, the more I could actually connect with the people, connect with them one-on-one, build relationship with them. And the more I learned, the more respect they had for me. I mean, just say I'm an American, they have lots of respect anyway, because Americans were up here somewhere. The other school of thought is that whatever your religious persuasion is or your church's dress code is here in America, that's what you would take overseas. And so if your church said men should wear button-ups and a tie and women should wear skirts, that's what everybody who you spread the gospel to should do, is they should become like you. And if that's to live in little missions compounds and not engage in this or this, but engage in this and this, that's what you do. Like it's a very confined set of rules. What I found worked best for Mongolians who are super relational people was to adapt as much of the culture and the language as I could. Learning the language, learning the culture, participating in their festivities as allowed, and learning their idioms, learning different aspects of, because they're so relational. They could have a group of, say, 10 people sitting, and there could be two conversations going on, okay? Now that would be really distracting for me because I'm having a conversation with someone and there's all these conversations going on. But for them, they would all participate in all 5 of these conversations, even though they were having conversations between 2 of them. They'd be listening to all the others and then giving their input. And I just find that absolutely phenomenal because I can't do that. But they're so relational that nothing else, really anything else, pales in comparison to these relationships that they have, which is a big difference between us and them, if you want to say a cultural difference between Americans or Mongolians. So, but what I learned from that is when you really engage people on their terms, then you have a voice. So like another experience is I walk into a bank, banks were the worst. They had no concept of lines, and so it was a crowd, and the one who crowds forward the best and pushes their way forward the best gets to see the teller. You could be at the bank a very long time when you decide that standing in line is the way to get to the front. But also, they assumed that I did not speak their language, and so therefore I was a non-person, a non-entity. I did not deserve to go to the front of the line. So I would wait patiently, because that was how I was trained, is you wait in line, and eventually I would have to say something to them in Mongolian, like, excuse me, I was here first, or something. And they would just look at you with eyes this big. It's a person. And I think sometimes in my experience in the culture around me, which I don't claim to have a real good grasp of the Cape Cod culture, a lot of it, is that when I can engage someone one-on-one, they realize I'm a person too. So it seems like Jesus was a very relational person. In fact, he took 12 disciples as his closest companions and did everything with them for 3 years. That's a long time if you think of it, and a short time too, depending. They did everything together. And so all that opportunity to see each other and be with each other was just like, they were able to be sponges and just absorb in. Even if they couldn't comprehend and understand everything he was saying, they were taking it all in. And that's a very similar experience I had in Mongolia, is the Mongolians wanted to be with me because I was an American, because that put me somewhere up here and I was an important person. They wanted to be with me. But the ones that really took an opportunity to get to know me and not just try to, look, I'm close to the foreigner, and get some sort of kudos from that from other people, were able to be a part of experiencing Jesus and what it meant to walk as a disciple of Christ. And I would say one of the most difficult things as I've transitioned back to here is I don't have women in relationship like that I have around me now, where we work in the garden together and we go to the grocery store together and we just, whatever we do, living life, we do together. I mean, obviously I have a husband now, so that limits some of those things, but there's such value in mentoring and discipleship and living life and being together. And that's why as mothers, we have such a tremendous ability to input into the lives of our children, because we're doing so much together. So what prepared me for work in Mongolia? Like I said, I'm just a farm girl. What did I learn on a farm? I'll be brief. Work ethic. Learned to work really hard. You had to, basically. It was you do it or you're in the doghouse. You learned to obey orders. My dad would say, do this. And there was times when he had this do this tone of voice that you did it right now. I mean, everything stopped. And it's like They say jump, and you say how high, you'd better be in the air. I learned to lead. There was times as I got older and knew the ropes with different things that he'd put me in charge of particular projects. And I also had a chance to really observe my dad's dependence on God. And farmers are very dependent people, actually. They do a lot. They have a lot of work to do, but when your cow gets sick, you call the vet, but sometimes there just isn't an answer why your cow's sick, and so you pray. When no rain comes, you pray. When there's too much rain, you pray. And sometimes you watch your crops rot in the ground, and sometimes you watch them wither. And you realize that what that's going to mean for your income, and you pray because you have 5 kids to feed and you still have work to do. So all these things were building a foundation, a groundwork for me. My parents were believers from the time I was fairly young, so watching that it put a lot of good things in my head, I think. Then I went to college and had a chance to put some of this work ethic, self-discipline, study habits into practice for myself, and formed relationships for myself outside of my parents. Influence and guidance, that sort of thing. To learn what to do with money by myself without my parents saying, that would not be a good purchase. Or, yeah, that's a great idea. I think you should get that. And my parents were really, really helpful, actually, when it came to money management. Did a lot to teach us. My relationship with Christ became my own in college. And there were some very distinct movements to where that, experiences to where that happened. And then like I mentioned, I went to serve at his mansion, which is a residential center for men and women with addictions. I worked there over 9 years, and there's a lot of really good lessons to learn about serving others, loving when it's hard. See, growing up, there's a lot of, especially for a kid, it's about me. What can mom and dad do for me? And you go to college, and it's still a pretty much me-centered world. When you're going to work with other people who are hurting and broken, you really have a chance to understand what serving and service is, what it means to love when it's hard. Suddenly you feel like, gee, this is how my parents felt with me. And I also learned what it meant to be open and honest with my mentor, discipler, and in encouraging people I was mentoring and discipling to be open and honest and seeing what God would do through that process. I also gave someone 1 Corinthians 11:1 to read. I couldn't say Margaret because I didn't remember who I gave them to.
I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the teachings, just as I passed them on to you.
Okay, so holding on to the teachings of Christ as I pass them on to you. So it put me in a position of understanding that I was being Christ to people, that what they were seeing in me was actually them learning something about Christ. And so all these lessons together from my life culminated in who I was, and this is what I took to Mongolia with me. And what I could give as an understanding to people around me. Well, when I got to Mongolia, I couldn't speak their language. I went to the grocery store to find salt. Do you know how we buy salt? In the little container with the Morton's lady on it? Or a off-brand of that, like a grocery store brand, but they look the same, right? Just a different color. They don't have that in Mongolia. They buy salt in little plastic bags. And so I stood in the grocery store looking around to see the Morton's lady. There wasn't one. And I stood there looking for a white-skinned person. So I could say, do you speak English? And I finally found someone. And she said, yes. I said, can you please show me where the salt is? And so I took advantage. I bought salt and flour probably at the same time. So I'd have something to try to figure out how to eat there. And just realized suddenly how I was put in such a position of dependence. Okay, I was a tough farm girl. I could do it on the farm. I could go to college and get that figured out. I could go to his mansion and even be in a position of leadership. And all of a sudden, I'm like a little kid. I can't even find something in a grocery store. I can't speak to the people around me. And so the dilemma became then, okay, who's around me? It was people in my language school that became my closest relationships. My Mongolian language teacher, I had 2 of them, a couple of Koreans, an Australian, and a couple of Americans. And it was probably in my second year of language, well, actually my second year, I said, I can't handle the classroom, because the Koreans learn so fast, their language is very similar. They just memorize a different set of words, plug it in, they have the same language structure and their verbs, their nouns, all that's in the same place, so it's really easy. And so they're off way over here somewhere ahead of the rest of us, and I can't keep up with I am the slow one in the class. So I said, okay, I want individual lessons. And my language teacher said to me, you know, you're such an interesting person. I'm like, okay, that's what people tell me all the time. I'm an American and I'm too small. All Americans are what they picture in movies. Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I'm like, well, obviously that's not me. So she said, but the thing about you that's really interesting and compelling is that you never get angry. She said, all Mongolians are angry, if you haven't noticed. And I had noticed that by then. She said, in most all of my students, at some point while I'm teaching them, have explosions of anger and frustration. She's like, you've never had that. How come? Oh, well, I'm glad to tell you. It's because Jesus has changed me. I used to be very angry. And so I could tell her the story of how God had worked in my life in very simple Mongolian, because that's all I could speak back then. So let me just look at my notes for a minute here. So when I got to Mongolia, what I realized is life is missions. Being a missionary is not a title you give someone who has a certain job. Life is missions, and missions is life. That should be how it is for all of us. And I know that's what Glenn's been sharing with us too. Almost every Sunday, he puts it in somewhere, sometimes very consciously, and sometimes it's just a part of whatever else he's specifically saying in the message. Life is missions, and missions is life. Every encounter, everything that happens to me is something that God is wanting to use for his glory. And he can. It can be, I'm just by my little me, myself, and I having some alone time, and something comes to mind that I should not be thinking about. Well, I have a choice. Am I going to choose to think rightly? Am I going to choose to take my thoughts captive, or am I not? We all have these opportunities. We go out and we're in conversation with someone, an opportunity arises, a door opens to share something about the Lord. Are we going to? I know yesterday my husband had a chance to share just a little testimony about God with a couple of Bob and Margaret's neighbors. Just a short story of an experience we had, but it gave testimony to God. And I was so excited that God had given him that opportunity. Because it's what we want. We want to have opportunities where we're in relationship with people that don't know God, people that have pain and bitterness and heartache and brokenness in their lives, and be able to say, look, God answers prayer. And pray now that they think about it. And that they'll want to talk more with whoever, my husband or Bob and Margaret, or it's just all part of a relationship. So that clarity was just there for me. Missions is life, life is missions. It doesn't matter if I can't speak to the Mongolians in their own language, and I can't speak to them in English because they don't know it. I have to live as Jesus. Now, I should have that same clarity right now, even though I speak in English and you all understand it just fine, I hope. I could speak to you in Mongolian, but that wouldn't help either. The next thing I would say in Mongolia is just I experienced things I'd never experienced before, and one of them, which probably seems very obvious, is an incredible, intense loneliness. I was alone in a way I'd never been alone before. There was 2.5 years of the time that I lived there where I did not have English-speaking teammates of any sort, where it was simply me and the Mongolians. And of course, God's always a part of the equation. But that aloneness made me see just the key importance of God in my life and how much he is the one that must fill me and keep me and guide me and how important his love is for me when there isn't somebody around to have any sort of exchanges of conversation or this sort of thing. And the reality is, it has to be the same today. God has to be the one who fills me, who keeps his hope and his joy in front of me, so that in any relationship I have, I'm relating out of what Christ has done in my own heart and how he has filled me. So I'm not coming to Tim and saying, fill me, meet my needs. No, I'm coming to Tim as someone whose God has met my needs, so I can love him freely and anyone else that I'm in relationship with. And out of that is what I want to be able to share Christ to with my neighbors and the people around me. Intense loneliness, dependency on God. Let's be honest, it's hard to be dependent on God when you live in America. We speak the language, we understand the grocery stores, we understand something in the culture, especially most of you who've lived here on Cape Cod all of your lives, or a good share of your lives. You know what's going on around you. You go to work, you got this life figured out. And I mean, things happen in it that are tough, that bring us to our knees and cause us to cry out to people and say, pray for me. But I think dependency on God is something more. It really is that picture of a little child. For everything, what are they saying? Mommy, mommy, mommy. And they're asking questions, why, right? You ever experienced that as parents? Of course. And it's just I don't feel like I'm saying anything new to you guys. I'm preaching to the choir, but to remind you of the importance of being like little children and to just put yourself in a place of, Bopa remembers coming to America and not being able to speak English very well and not understanding things, and Maciel remembers coming to America and everything's different, and maybe others of you. You know, Ben's from Hawaii. I don't know, maybe it's a whole different culture over there, I would think. And I'm from Wisconsin. It's a whole different culture over there. But to remember that we need to position ourselves as a place of dependence every day. So tomorrow, I'm going to get up in the morning, and I know what we're going to do. We are going to go do landscaping. It will be tree work or mulching or something, but that's what we're going to do. What I did in Mongolia is I woke up in the morning, and I'm going to do the same thing here as I did there. And I said, okay, God, what do you want me to do today? Now, I knew there that I was going to go to language school, or once I got to my place of work, I was going to teach English, or I was going to counseling with teenagers, or I was whatever. I had a set schedule for each of my days with the work that I had lined up. But I'd say, God, what is it you want? Because in the midst of what my commitments are, you want me to share about you. You want to speak and act and move. So what is it you want today? And I wouldn't necessarily have a clear answer in my ear right then. But I did have experiences, two I'll share with you. One, I had taught English for the day, and I stayed after in the office. I shared an office with 4 other English teachers. They were all Mongolian. And I was just sitting in my office, probably planning some curriculum for the next day or whatever, and one of my students came in. She was a high school student, and she said, "Teacher, why do you love Jesus?" And I thought, I'm glad you asked. I'm also really glad there's no one else here, so I can answer you more freely. So it was an interesting conversation. I pray that that girl still thinks about it. Another situation I had is in my house in the countryside. Actually, I bought myself a little log cabin. I had no running water than water I had pumped from a truck, a 5-ton truck of water, pumped well into a cistern beneath my house, and then I had running water till the cistern went dry. So I knew I was low on water, and it was a Sunday, and I knew the hours the well house was open. So I walked over there, and it's about a 45-minute walk, but it was a nice day, and it was closed. So obviously the person went for a late lunch and hadn't come back, or wasn't coming back, and there's no sign, and you just never know. It's just supposed to be open, so that's when you go. So I thought, if I walk all the way home and back, that's an hour and a half. I don't feel up to that. So there's a little, it's actually a pretty nice restaurant, motel restaurant, real close. So I walked over there and thought, I'll just have a cup of coffee, and then I'll come and check the well and see if it's open. So I sat down and had a cup of coffee, and was just thinking about the different Mongolian people in my life and the relationships and just praying for them while I was drinking my coffee. And in walks a lady that I haven't seen in a long time, like 4 or 5 months. She was actually a fill-in teacher for me when I lived in the capital city, but had moved out to the countryside, and her husband is a building contractor. He built schools, so they're wealthy. And so I said hi to her, and she was just shocked. Oh, I've been thinking about you, and I just couldn't find your phone number to get a hold of you, but I've been wanting to talk to you. And I'm like, great, here I am. Thank you, Lord. Because if the well was closed, I wouldn't be there. It wasn't closed, right? So God used just the Mongolians' view of time, which is when you feel like doing something. If it's 10 o'clock, as long as you're there by 10:59, it's still 10 o'clock, so it doesn't matter, right? You can be very loose. Kind of like how it seems we do church here occasionally. So I had a chance to talk with this lady, and I was just very blessed because to me it was immediately clear that my inconvenience was for God's glory. Now, how often do we think that when we're stuck in traffic on the bridge? No, we're sweating and thinking, get out of my way. But to use opportunities, so you're stuck in traffic. If you're by yourself, what do? Pray. To develop eyes that see every opportunity around you, because God wants to glorify himself in us. He wanted to do that when I was in Mongolia, and when I was in New Hampshire at his mansion, and when I was a child growing up. He wants to do that right now here with us on Cape Cod. So I would say of all the lessons that I've learned, being dependent on God, prayer, and then the third is the importance of being in the Word. Well, let me just ask you this. When do you struggle most with your thoughts, for those of you who are utterly human like me and struggle with their thoughts? When you're in a crowd of people talking? When you're sitting with your family around the dinner table? I guess it depends on your family. When you're alone, right? When you're really alone and no one's going to know what you're thinking. And if you do anything with that or not. But God knows, because you're not alone, right? God knows you're not alone, ever. And so what had been sort of ingrained in me to have a disciplined Bible study and reading of the Word became an absolute necessity for me there. This isn't just what good Americans do. This is, I understand, if I'm going to think rightly right now, I need what the Word of God has to say. I need that reminder. I need that food. I need those thoughts. I need God's thoughts in my mind. Because this is hard. When you choose to do the work of God, do you think someone opposes that? Just try to say the name of Jesus in Bourne, Massachusetts. Right? It's very, very offensive, unless, of course, you're standing in church. I hope none of you are offended. I observed that what happens when you're a missionary to any country, and there's over 6,000 languages on this earth, is that there's, oddly enough, one Bible that gets translated into every language. One Bible, not written in English, right? Written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. One Bible for all cultures. Now, does that make the Bible culturally relevant for any of us? No. The Bible tells us God's culture for all of us. It doesn't matter what color our skin is or what language we speak. God has a culture. He has a way he wants us to live. He has a way he wants us to think, what our heart should be, the position of our heart should be. And that's why I needed the Word, because I was going to be the living Word for these people around me. Our hearts are the same. Do you think Mongolians struggle with fear, with anger, with bitterness, with tiredness, with love? Yes, exactly the same as us. I mean, If you weren't looking at them and you could understand everything they were saying, you'd think you're talking to your next door neighbor. There's just no difference. So since we have one God who is Lord over all, we have one Bible that addresses the needs of every person on the whole world, every person on this earth, no matter what your culture is. What does that mean for Cape Cod? How am I going to live in Cape Cod? That's the question that's really before us. The only real point of my sharing anything about Mongolia and my experiences is because I'm wrestling with what it means to live rightly here on Cape Cod, to be a missionary here in my own home, with my neighbors, with the people I work with people in AA, wherever God has me, whoever he puts me in contact with. If you look at the list, what is the language? Cambodian? Brazilian? English? Okay, we're very diverse, aren't we, Maciel? Very diverse on Cape Cod. And anywhere in the East, actually. What are the people groups? How many are here? I don't know, but I'm assuming that it's more than 2 or 3. What are the religious backgrounds of all the people? You see some interesting church buildings when you drive around here. Things I'd never heard of. Tim and I have had to look up some online just to see what they were. What are Cape Cod's holidays? There's more than just Christmas here. What's the main food? Can we say diverse? Look at our church body. Let's look around you. How many people here are not like native soil-born Americans? There's a couple of them. And look at the size of us. We're tiny. And look what God has brought together. It's awesome. What in our culture points to Jesus in this diverse, multicultural place that we live in? What points to Jesus here? So what do I have to offer Cape Cod? I can pray. I can seek to be dependent on God each day for what he has for me. I can seek to love the people around me. I can seek to serve. I can seek to work hard and just be a good example of a hard worker and someone that's respectable. I can look for opportunities. I can pray for my husband because he has way more opportunities to speak than I do. I'm just used to being the one in front when it comes to discipling and missions. I never had someone to be behind before. So sometimes it's kind of good, actually. So if you have any thoughts or questions, like I said, I wanted us to think together. I've just been doing the out loud thinking. I'm happy to talk with anyone, and I think Glenn might have a few things. He just sometimes does.
Can you comment on your vest?
This is a traditional Mongolian, would be a holiday shirt that they would wear.
Amen. Thank you, Amy. That's good. Really, a lot of things to think about. So if God tapped you on the shoulder and he commissioned you to be a missionary to Cape Cod, what would it look like? It's a challenging thought, isn't it? We know pastors who have been sent here from Africa to be missionaries to Cape Cod. In fact, one of them, they said, you're going to Cape Cod, they had to get an atlas out to find out where it was. So God is sending missionaries here from other nations. But you know what? He's called us. And I just really appreciate, Amy, what you shared today, just the practical wisdom. And when we begin to think of it in terms of going to Mongolia or going to another country and what it means to be a missionary, and our hearts start to go pitter-patter and go, oh my goodness, then take that list and say, what happens if I cross the street? What happens if I talk to people that I meet whether it's daily or weekly, people that you can meet here on Cape Cod. And take that framework with you. Because that's who we are. We're called to be missionaries to Bourne. I want to close with our benediction, but before I read it, I just want to point a couple things. It's Matthew 28, 18 through 20. And Jesus said that all authority is given to him and that he gives it to us as we are sent. So we go in his authority. Second thing, he said, verse 19, that we are to go and make disciples. And we think the verb is go. That's not a verb, participle. The verb is to make disciples. And it literally says, in your going, make disciples. As we go. In your going. As you go about living your life every single day, look for the opportunity to influence those around you and to make disciples. And that's what missionaries do. Now, we're going to be talking more about what that means because we need to be trained to do that. But I want you to begin to see the paradigm shift. Pray about that and wrestle with that this week. What does it mean to be called to be missionaries here? So let's stand together. This is the commission that Jesus gives us. This is our job. Verse 18, Matthew 28. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always,